Hello, this is George from Ireland, and I'm carrying on my series about the Ulster Troubles. In 1989, which is where I left off, so I talked about how the Anglo-Irish Agreement had been signed some years earlier, and it hadn't improved the conflict a great deal. It hadn't improved the situation. Obviously, it angered Unionists. However, the SDLP was satisfied that the British government was doing something to please nationalist opinion. That is, getting the Irish government involved to monitor the situation. And RUC officers tended to go around with UDR patrols because the Taoiseach, Dr. Fitzgerald, said the RUC could be trusted to be even-handed. That wasn't always true of the UDR. And Dr. Fitzgerald was happy to pose for photos shaking hands with an RUC officer, which gave lie to the notion that they were anti-Catholic or whatever, or anti-Irish. I mean, they were Irish, even though they didn't call themselves Irish usually. Would say they're Ulster and or British. So as I said, there was some opposition to the Anglo-Irish Agreement within the Conservative Party. About a tenth of Conservative MPs set their face against it. Most prominently Ian Gow, who'd been a bosom buddy of Mrs. Thatcher up until that point. In 1990, the IRA assassinated him with a bomb under his car in his Eastbourne constituency. There was an Ian Gow memorial lecture for several years after. I don't know if it's still going. And certainly Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was very close to him. The leader of the opposition at the time, Neil Kinnock, said he had many disagreements with me and I with him, but it's appalling that he should have been killed for his views. So by-election was held. The Liberal Democrats considered not fielding a candidate to signal their abhorrence of terrorism. They would let the Conservative win unopposed. But Reynolds persuaded the Lib Dem leader Paddy Ashdown to put up a candidate. And they managed to win by a landslide of what had been a rock-solid Conservative seat full of pensioners, because Thatcher was coming to the doldrums of our unpopularity owing to the community charge. Anyway, later that year, November the 22nd, Margaret Thatcher fell on her sword. She's pushed out because of that tax, but I don't want to be sidetracked into issues which don't pertain to the Troubles. I ought to have mentioned that there was another Republican splinter group. Brendan Behan, writer and sometime IRA man, said that when two IRA men walk into a room, the first thing they decide on is the basis of the next split, because Irish republicanism is extraordinarily vociferous. The INLA had a breakaway, and the splitists called themselves the Irish People's Liberation Organisation, founded in 1986. They carried out a few attacks. The Provisional IRA found them to be annoying. Then in 1992, the Provisionals moved against the IPLO all across Belfast, killed a couple of them and severely beat up others. So the IPLO ran up the white flag, in effect, and handed over their arms. That was the end of them. I mentioned Charlie Haughey, who dominated Southern Irish politics from the late 80s to the early 90s. He was Taoiseach of Fianna Fáil, and he had led his party to vote against the Anglo-Irish Agreement that had still passed, and he denounced Northern Ireland as a police state. When he'd been Taoiseach in the early 80s, he announced to his conference that I've called the British government to set a timetable for withdrawal, but that didn't happen. He'd had some early consultations with Thatcher at the beginning of the 80s and talked about various reforms that could be made. Well, he got too carried away, and he'd been telling his party that they were going to have a united republic within several years. Didn't happen. When he went to visit Belfast, he required huge RUC protection because loyalists and unionists were telling him he was definitely not wanted. So there was a cartoon in the Irish Times with a Haughey surrounded by RUC men saying, "Thank God it's a police state," because they were saving his bacon. IRA suspects in the Irish Republic were to be extradited to the United Kingdom to face trial, but that didn't happen always. Sometimes courts in Southern Ireland were persuaded that this person couldn't be guaranteed a fair trial. There were other things that went off that happens occasionally, is the IRA blowing themselves up with their own bombs, which is poetic justice. Loyalist terrorists likewise. It was figured out that sometimes they were married men wearing wedding rings, and wires must have touched that and formed a circuit, and that was the end of that. The Republic of Ireland was changing a bit, well, certainly into the early 90s. Mary Robinson became president in 1990. She was married to a Protestant. There had been a Protestant president previously, Dr. Douglas Hyde. But She was a woman who said, well, we must really break down sectarian divides as she had in her personal life, but to liberalise things. And she'd been calling for the right to have contraception, the right to divorce, and so forth. So the late 80s was, I suppose, the last stand of Catholic nationalism per se, and the Republic of Ireland is becoming properly secular, one of the last countries in the world to permit divorce. Another thing is, by that stage, we'd been part of the European Economic Community for quite a long time, and there's massive subvention from other EEC countries, including Great Britain, was beginning to have a visible effect. Our roads were improving, more people had access to tertiary education, and so on. And the job situation had picked up as well. No longer were half the young people going abroad. There were no longer so many dilapidated buildings. So we were always in the top third of income for countries. We were moving towards the middle of that top third, eventually to the top of that top third. One Protestant from Armagh said in 1989 that the South doesn't want us because we're too expensive. Obviously, Northern Ireland was the most subsidised part of the United Kingdom. And if Great Britain wasn't subsidising that, if Northern Ireland joined us, then we in the south of Ireland would have to subsidise it. So public opinion in the Republic of Ireland was fairly nationalist. There was some latent republicanism that would be brought out if someone in the north, well, a Catholic anyway, was killed by the security forces in disputed circumstances. But one unionist summed up Dublin's attitude, say to the British Army, get out, but please stay. Because if we got what we wanted, what we supposedly wanted, then loyalist terrorists would be attacking Irish troops in the north. And the Irish army, only having about 10,000 men, would have found that very difficult to handle. Another thing is, loyalists seem so horrible that some people in the Republic of Ireland just didn't want the north, saying our country works, why would we want these people screwing everything up? Anyway, so Labour and Fine Gael were open to reaching an accommodation with Great Britain. Fianna Fáil not so much, because it was more ardently nationalistic. Largely it was just paying lip service to its Republican heritage from the 1920s. This anti-partition oratory was a good drum to bang come election time. De Valera won twice offered the North on a plate in the Second World War, 2 public offers from Churchill, turned it down flat. So it was something that people said they wanted, but it was just a totem. When it was a possibility, it was actually refused. There was an opinion poll in the Republic of Ireland in the early 90s which showed that most people had never spent a night in the north. And the word Ireland was used invariably to exclude the north. I remember on the phone book having to say this number for Ireland, including Northern Ireland, in case you weren't sure. Anyway, the Republic of Ireland improved considerably, made it less objectionable for unionists to join. I knew someone from a Protestant unionist background, a journalist, speaking to him about being at Queen's in the 80s, saying that they weren't in principle opposed to uniting with the South, but the real stumbling block was it being a confessional state, being unable to get an abortion. I thought, well, that was quite controversial. A lot of Protestants would be morally opposed to that as well. I think it wasn't allowed in Northern Ireland either. I know these women could travel to Great Britain, but that was true of women in the South. Anyway, the Cold War came to an end in 1989 with the communist dictatorships falling in Eastern Europe. Soviet Union soon split up, and democracy was introduced everywhere. There were peace talks between Israel and Palestine. Now, ironically, many Americans supported the oppression of Palestine, but also opposed democracy in Northern Ireland, some of them who knew nothing about it. Lots of Irish Americans, about 40 million, about half of whom are Protestants, some of whom were sending money to the IRA, not realising the IRA deliberately killed Protestant civilians, knowing them to be civilians. So what some of these Irish Americans were, particularly naive and ill-informed ones, was paying for their distant cousins to be killed. So there were no sectarian laws in Northern Ireland ever. Everyone had the right to vote in parliamentary elections right from the beginning. The elections were totally fair. I've never heard it alleged that ballot boxes were stuffed or that bogus votes were cast. So even the IRA's political face won seats. That's how fair it was. It's hard to think of any other country where that sort of thing was allowed to happen. And the security forces, certainly after the early 70s, almost never killed civilians. And Jim Molyneux pointed out that the Unionists were the majority, of course. But anyway, as the Cold War was over, the UK was no longer so important to the United States, and American public opinion was highly sympathetic to Irish nationalism. and a lot of people there were very credulous, just lapped up what people had to say. My other friends from the South would go to America and be asked, how's the war? Well, there were huge posters of Gerry Adams, as though he was popular in Ireland, getting 2% of the vote in the South, being rejected. And so the IRA was reviled by many people in the South. And in the early 70s, there'd been a lot of ambivalence, even some people foursquare behind it, certainly in the South, because of things like Bloody Sunday. But by the 90s, that no longer pertained. So previously, the US hadn't pushed London too hard on the Northern Ireland issue for fear of undermining the Atlantic Alliance. But it was no longer so important to mollify the UK by the early 90s. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why the United Kingdom became more open to persuasion.